Hello and welcome. I am Lian Buan and this is Rappler Talk. We'll try to move forward the discussion of former President Rodrigo Duterte in The Hague. We'll operate on the premise of what Justice Secretary Boying Remulla said as it being a done deal. So for now, we'll try to set aside the domestic squabbles and try to focus on what's happening in the international scene, particularly in the International Criminal Court. And for that, we have Attorney Ruben Carranza. He's a former commissioner of the PCGG and a senior expert at the International Center for Transitional Justice. Attorney Carranza, good morning from Manila.
Good morning. Good morning.
So siguro let's start by trying to explain to Filipinos ano ba yung ICC because we're grappling with it only now although ilang taon na tong investigation ng ICC. But why is it like that? Bakit nauna yung arrest warrant bago nalaman ni Duterte na suspect pala siya at meron pang sealed warrant na nangyari?
Filipinos are familiar with criminal law in the Philippines, and I think to an extent, criminal law that they see on TV that happens in the United States. Some of that is helpful to understand the ICC, but a lot of it is also unhelpful because there's a tendency to expect that what will happen in the ICC has its counterparts in what might happen in Philippine courts or even in American courts. What's important, I think, to understand is that the ICC isn't the court of any particular country. It's an international criminal court. So what you have now in the ICC, I think, reflects how different countries, colonizers and former colonies, have come to build a legal institution, an international criminal court that is very flawed, but exists and is trying to build a practice of justice that might help deal with both conflicts and crisis in the world.
So yung particular set of rules ba, especially sa ICC na nauuna yung arrest warrant, is that a feature of international criminal law? Kasi head of state o parang target nila like really like high level officials so they can easily escape, easily hide. So is that why that the rule is as is?
In a way, because what preceded the ICC were the ad hoc tribunals. The United Nations created the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, or the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, and then a separate one for Rwanda, ICTR. And of course, you also have the Sierra Leone Court, the Cambodia Extraordinary Chambers, and then subsequently after the ICC, a few other ad hoc courts. So you're right in the sense that many defendants, suspects in those tribunals were either heads of state or high-level officials, civilian and military, where taking physical, personal custody of them proved to be very challenging, and that this is a challenge that was never. It's not anticipated. So one way in which the ICC rules anticipate the challenge of enforcing its warrants is to seal its warrants of arrest. Sarado, no? Hindi mo na nilalabas sa publiko na hanggat hindi mo pa alam paano mo siya ibibigay, ipapakita, at paano mo siya i-enforce against the person to be arrested.
Yung being a non-member nga, Attorney Carranza, is the big jurisdiction issue dito sa kaso ni Duterte because he withdrew in 2019 thinking that it would have already stopped the investigation, and there are opinions, clearly, kasi may two dissenting opinion nga, diba, sa appeals chamber na yung dapat hindi na apektuhan ng withdrawal ay proseso ng korte, ng ICC, at hindi yung preliminary examination lang na inopen dati ni Prosecutor Bensuda nung 2018. You think this will remain to be a problem for Prosecutor Karim Khan later on, or you think he's locked it in, yung jurisdiction niya?
It will be raised by Rodrigo Duterte's lawyer. Sabi kasi, hindi lang si Nick Kaufman ang lawyer ngayon, may iba pang kasali. And as you said, the fact that out of the 5 judges in the appellate chamber that ruled on the question of jurisdiction, 2 dissented. lawyers will use the dissenting opinions to challenge jurisdiction again. Now, it's important to say two things here about jurisdiction and challenging jurisdiction. First, the Philippines already challenged the jurisdiction of the ICC. In fact, Marcos Jr. and his government challenged the jurisdiction of the ICC. And that also says something about whether Marcos Jr. is really interested in justice and accountability by cooperating with the ICC and having Rodrigo Duterte arrested. Because if he were, he wouldn't have challenged jurisdiction to begin with. Right? If he were interested in justice for victims of the drug war, he would have already cooperated with the ICC. In fact, he would have rejoined the ICC and then cooperated with the ICC, and all of these issues would really be no longer relevant. We wouldn't be talking about this now. And that's how you ended up having this issue appealed all the way to the appellate chamber. So I'm just compressing this entire story. What's important is that the appellate chamber, the majority, essentially said that it's not really time to discuss jurisdiction. But the two dissenters say, you don't measure jurisdiction in terms of time in relation to when the crimes were committed, but when the action of the ICC's prosecutor began. And it began without saying explicitly, not during preliminary examination, but during the actual investigation, which happened after the withdrawal had taken effect. Very technical for Filipinos, but I think it's important to say that this is a substantial argument that I'm almost certain will be raised by Rodrigo Duterte's lawyers, and they will be raised as soon as possible. They will be raised in the next couple of weeks, and they will be raised before the September 23 confirmation of charges hearing, when the confirmation of charges hearings begin. So that's the first issue that will be raised, and it's important to already rule on it, because if the court were to say it has no jurisdiction, then there will be no trial.
Let's assume na President Marcos has made up his mind and now he does believe in the ICC's jurisdiction. Can he cure this entirely by rejoining the ICC, or yung isa pang feature ng Rome Statute na referral na lang, which in some countries they have done? Is there a way to cure it and like make this jurisdictional problem go away?
No, but theoretically, yes. No, because events have happened. This entire set of events have unfolded based on the legal premises that existed when they happened. You cannot erase them by rejoining the ICC. You cannot make the potential flaws for the prosecutor go away by as you said, having a referral, another state referring the case so that the prosecutor can, because that will only trigger an investigation. It will not cure this investigation that became the basis for the warrant of arrest. But it also possibly sends a message to the ICC that the Philippines will cooperate by rejoining the court. Now, I think that is in fact a better reason than anything else, because if you say you will cooperate with the court, you're telling the judges, you're telling the prosecutor that the Philippines will protect witnesses, that the Philippines will turn over documents, that the Philippines will allow its officials to testify at the court.
At what stage in the proceedings do we get to hear a full-blown discussion dun sa criminal liability ni former President Duterte, how the prosecutor is going to tie him into the individual crimes of the policemen and vigilantes? When do we stop hearing about, technical jurisdiction issues at punta na dun sa substantial merits of the case?
Initially at the confirmation of charges hearings. Sometimes we say hearing, but really it's not going to be one hearing. It probably will be a series of dates. It will start. It's supposed to start in September. so that even as we speak, the prosecutor is already turning over all the evidence it presently has, which also means that it may not have other evidence yet, because it's not over. It can still continue to collect evidence. But that's not for public consumption, right? We don't see that. We know it's happening, but we don't see what evidence has been given to the defense counsel. We will see that, hopefully, at the confirmation of judge's hearing. But there's also a possibility that we won't see it if there is, and I've not seen this happen, but if there is a closed session, because certain names will be mentioned, certain files might be disclosed. Although those things, sealing files, not disclosing them, can be done even prior to the confirmation of charges hearing.
As we speak, before September 23, alam na ni Duterte kung sino yung mga insider witness. Apart from those who have already, come public to say they are witness like Las Cañas and Matubato, malalaman niya na ba, alam niya na ba yan in the next few weeks?
Ideally, no, because they have numbers. The witnesses are represented by numbers. Okay. And what he will learn and what his lawyers will learn are what the testimony is about, okay, and not who. The problem, of course, is that if the testimony is very specific to an event, to a location, to a date, I don't know. Look, I don't know if Rodrigo Duterte actually kept tabs over who was being killed in his war on drugs. I think his mentality was, let people learn that these killings are happening, and they're happening on a large scale. And the degree to which this was inhumane was in his proclamations. He didn't care who was getting killed. He didn't care that children were being shot at. He may not even know who these people are, who the widow is who might testify, who the neighbor is who might talk about it. And that's the tragedy of it, because we're discussing it in such a technical way, and the person accused of the crime not only denies it, but doesn't even care that these are actual, real people who lost sons, daughters, family members.
So he will never know some of the insider witnesses?
Oh, eventually he will.
Beans, or...
Yes, eventually he will. There's another interesting aspect of this. On the ICC website, it's still up there, in English, in Filipino, and I hope eventually in Cebuano. There is a call for witnesses, right? It's been there for some time, but there's a paragraph there that actually explicitly asks members of the Philippine National Police and even the military to come forward. And those are potential insider witnesses. And so when we talk about insider witnesses, that's what we mean, right? People who are in the organizations and institutions that were, in this case, used to commit the violence committed during the drug war. He will learn who they are eventually, because if the trial proceeds, they will have to testify. The testimony, however, can be private or closed.
Okay, let's talk about an interim release, kasi merong case data sa ICC where kung saan i-release yung suspect, ayaw tanggapin kasi the conditions come to it, diba, na dapat ganito, ganyan. So let's say Duterte wants to be released to the Philippines. Si President Marcos ba, can he toss it back to the courts and say, what are my obligations here? Pwede ko bang i-enforce yung obligation ko sa isang release in the interim suspect, or is it just his political discretion kung tatanggapin niya pabalik si President Duterte in the interim?
Well, maybe that's one argument why the Philippines shouldn't rejoin, because ideally, a person who might be released on that basis should be released to a country that is a party to the ICC treaty. So that might make a difference. So you have restrictions, including no contact with other parties, no contact with witnesses, and it's very hard to monitor those restrictions. And so you can imagine releasing Rodrigo Duterte to the Philippines will create a nightmare for monitoring restrictions. That's why it's, even if interim release is given, and in this case, because there is no trial yet, the concerns of the court will be heightened, right? The reason why you arrest a person is to prevent him from obstructing justice, from intimidating or even committing violence on witnesses. We saw the Kenyatta case in Kenya where so many witnesses were killed or intimidated or bribed that at the end of that process,
during the ICC proceeding.
during the proceedings, that the prosecutor was forced to withdraw the charges. And so that's precisely what you want to prevent as a court. It's not just the prosecutor's interest, it's the interest of the judges themselves. So that it's giving an accused person who is still about to be tried interim release is very, very unlikely.
Well, that's that. Sabi ng marami, and I think narinig ko rin si Secretary Remulla kahapon, novel to eh. It's a novel case. Why is that? Is it because yung bansa mismo nung national yung umaresto sa kanya? Have we not seen this before?
He's not the first former president or former head of state to be arrested, detained by the ICC. I mentioned Laurent Gbagbo. Uhuru Kenyatta was the incoming president of Kenya when he was charged. He wasn't arrested, however. He was summoned, and he agreed to be summoned. He agreed to show up. So he did show up in court. What's interesting there was his vice president was also charged, so they both had to appear at the ICC. You have Jean-Pierre Bemba, who was vice president of the Democratic Republic of the Congo when he was arrested and detained. So you've had, you have, of course, Omar al-Bashir, who has not been arrested and is detained, but in Sudan because he was overthrown. So it's not novel in the sense of a head of state being charged or even being arrested. Laurent Gbagbo was arrested just a few days after the warrants were unsealed and then brought to the Ivory Coast. I don't think he even had any opportunity to challenge the arrest in an Ivorian court. So he just was taken to the ICC. Maybe it's novel for, cronies of the children of Marcos cronies, because the idea of accountability is probably alien to them. They've never seen Marcos or Duterte, for that matter, or people who benefit from Marcos or Duterte being held accountable. So they say things like that. But to be fair, Rodrigo Duterte is an ex-president of a non-state party, so that you can compare him to Netanyahu and Putin, who have warrants of arrest but have not been arrested and challenging in terms of having them arrested. So that here, I recall Medialdea at the hearing saying that the ICC wants to use this as a show to demonstrate its relevance as an institution. And I hate to say this, but to some extent, the ICC needs to show its relevance, needs to be taken seriously, because it's difficult for an international criminal court to be taken seriously in a world where power is so unequal among states.
We have heard of ICC suspects being arrested by other countries. Diba yung last nga lang, yung Libyan suspect sa Italy. But it's his country, kaya rin siguro nabibigyan ng legs yung narrative na sinuko mo yung soberenya mo kasi mismong bansa niya yung nag-aresto sa kanya. In that case, unique ba siya or has this happened before?
Well, the first referral to the ICC, which made it really complex, was by Uganda of its own national. The leader of the Lord's Resistance Army, of course, was never captured. He just died. But that was, in fact, a problem anticipated by the ICC in creating the possibility of a referral, because you could refer yourself and your own citizens to the ICC. And if a transition happens, it's possible that you would have a new government coming in, turning over people who previously had so much impunity that they thought they could get away with it. Although now we also face that problem with Omar al-Bashir. There was a transition, but his the government that overthrew him refuses to turn him over to the court.
Alright, sige, let's talk numbers naman, but let's try to frame it a different way, yung 43 killings dun sa arrest warrant. Yung sa case ni Dominic Ongwen, diba, like more than 4,000 victims were represented, made representations, but at the end he was convicted of 70 counts of crimes against humanity by murder. So help us understand the disparity between thousands of the crimes, yet only 70 counts.
There will be thousands of victims because first, while you commit a crime against humanity, for example, by definition, it's two or more persons are victims.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you could have one crime, one event, one massacre, for example, and several persons being killed in that event because two or more persons were killed. Right? So that you could have one charge, one count with several victims. Second, victims by ICC definition include family members, can even include institutions. And so you would have additional individuals coming forward as victims, right? Entire families, for example, or entire communities. In the Mali case, you have communities claiming that this accused destroyed religious structures so that the entire community, hundreds of people, would be victims. So it's not a one crime, one person type of situation. It's a one crime, and this is why the nature of the crimes is important. War crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. This will inherently involve more people than the actual number of counts of these crimes that you charge.
Let's pivot a little bit to transitional justice, which, may not be entirely legal. It can be moral, philosophical, and everything. So let's start with Vice President Sara Duterte saying, tanggapin na nating hindi na siya babalik. From a transitional justice perspective, how do you think we should frame that, yung bring him home? Ano ba dapat yung pinag-uusapan? Do Filipinos deserve to see a former president, although he will be convicted, if ever na makauwi pa rin?
On one hand, you have these appeals to a person who's old, a person who's sickly, a person who's popular, and you want him back. But then you also have demands for justice, demands for accountability that many people understand as punishment, right? And punishment means, in most cases, imprisonment, although you also have examples of punishment that don't require imprisonment, and maybe we can go to that. But transitional justice includes prosecution, includes criminal prosecutions and punishment by imprisonment. But it also includes letting victims know what happened and acknowledging what has happened. And in many cases, criminal trials won't do that because prosecutors are more interested in evidence, in proving the guilt of an accused, and not the complete truth about what happened. Certainly not, in some cases, context and history of what happened, unless they go into motive, unless they go into evidence. And in the Duterte case, for example, you have I saw a mother who's from Davao whose 4 sons were killed one by one, right, by the Duterte death squad, and she has, I think, been quoted as saying that she feels some sense of relief and justice that this has happened, Duterte being brought to court, being detained. But actually, the killings of his 4 sons are not part of the case because they happened before the Philippines became part of the ICC. There you see the problem, which is criminal trials are not only unsatisfying, but also possibly painful. for people who feel excluded, who feel left out, who vicariously might say that is justice for me, but that is not exactly justice for me. And so in the work I do, for example, we help truth commissions that are not courts, that are not going to issue punishments, but will possibly name names, will unearth fact and history, and talk about what happened from the perspective mostly of victims, but can also invite perpetrators if they are willing to come forward. Then finally, reparations for victims. I should say there's reparations at the ICC. You have Article 75 that says there can be reparations for victims of the crime, and it's the convicted person's assets, aside from a fund called the Trust Fund for Victims, that will fund reparations. But take note, a conviction has to happen. And of course, the person convicted has to have assets for his assets to be used to fund reparations. That's different from, for example, the reparations that were given to victims of the Marcos dictatorship pursuant to a law that I actually helped draft, using Marcos' ill-gotten wealth to fund reparations. So 10,000 and more than 10,000 people received reparations. That can be done for victims of the drug war. And that can be done for victims of the drug war without waiting for the ICC to proceed, whether or not Rodrigo Duterte is convicted, whether or not anyone else is arrested and charged and tried. In fact, completely independent of the ICC.
Well, can we expect President Marcos to do an ad hoc compensation board, for example, na very similar to the compensation board na ginawa para sa crimes ng tatay niya na dinideny niya naman, no? So like with the benefit of hindsight now, again, about transitional justice, we saw how the Marcoses came home. We allowed them to come home. Obviously, there's a President Marcos now. Knowing what you know in your experience, has something changed in the Philippines that would make forgetting a little harder, na mas mapre-preserve yung truth without the need for any like burdensome truth commissions?
That's, the irony in this, in a way, is that it's a Marcos Jr. who is putting Rodrigo Duterte in detention, right? No matter how he denies it, his government cooperated with the ICC to make sure Rodrigo Duterte was arrested, taken out of the country, and obviously not for justice, not for accountability, but to get rid of a political rival. And that is what Marcos Sr. did, except that he declared martial law. And the irony, therefore, isn't so much that it's Marcos doing this, but that it is happening behind a facade of accountability, behind a facade of justice. And it's troubling because it does not address the question of how a president who was elected popularly with populist messaging that included claims, false claims, that the Philippines was overrun by drug addicts and we should kill them all. Right? And this trial, if it were to go to trial, will not address that question of how did millions of Filipinos come to support mass killing. And this trial, even if it leads to a conviction of Rodrigo Duterte, may not also lead to ensuring that it doesn't happen again. And so I think, and I'm not saying that this is the perfect response to that, but I think it's important to pursue other parallel avenues of justice that go into this question of, really, was there a necessity for a drug war? And really, even if you carried out a drug war, who should have been targeted? And if a president can do that, blame drug addicts for poverty, for inequality in the country, how does it prevent another president from blaming other types of people, from blaming Muslims or blaming Chinese people, for instance, people of Chinese ancestry, for the ills of the Philippines? So Um, you asked me earlier whether Marcos would support reparations for victims of the drug war. Jaime Marcos, in fact, co-sponsored a law for reparations for victims of the Marawi siege. Obviously, because to them it wouldn't intersect with accountability for the Marcos family, and I understand completely that when we deal with power, when we deal with the powerful, we cannot be purist. We cannot insist that they themselves should admit their own accountability before we work with you, before we support what you're doing to someone else who should also be held accountable. But at the same time, I think it's important, especially for activists, not to lose sight of the fact that this is also the same family that has escaped accountability. Mostly, we were able to recover their assets. We were able to fund reparations for their victims, but they have unpaid taxes.
Senator Amy Marcos also is boosting the narrative of Filipinos versus colonials. And again, comparing to an ICC case, yung kay Dominic Ongwen, it became a concern because according to some rhetoric, diba, the Ugandans felt like they should take care of their own accountability, reconciliation, may healing sila. How might human rights advocates deal with this? Like, paano ba nila ma-ensure na walang animosity na it was Filipinos versus foreigners?
A few years ago, the former president of Mexico, Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO, frustrated by a continuation of the drug war in his own country, attempted another approach. He called for and created a truth commission in a narrow way to look at forced disappearances that were happening in the course of that drug war. And families did show up, families of the disappeared. A few policemen actually showed up. They were trying to get the drug cartels to also show up. That didn't happen. Many families were satisfied because of, finally they were heard. They could see that the state wasn't only interested in prosecuting individuals, but also helping families. But of course, there were also families that were not satisfied. Their children were disappeared. They have never returned. It will always be imperfect. It will always be incomplete. But I think it's important to acknowledge victims first and foremost, which is what the Marcoses have not done, whether victims of the dictatorship or victims of the drug war.
Yeah, it's really hard to talk about like all the complexities of justice, what justice means to one victim versus what it means to another victim. I'll try to wrap it up na to satisfy the curiosity lang of some people. We have seen the lead counsel, Nick Kaufman. Magkano daw kaya yung binabayad ni Duterte dito? I tried to look back. I think nung pumunta tayo sa Permanent Court of Arbitration, 150 million pesos yung binayad sa firm, foreign firm.
An American firm, yeah.
Yeah. Ganito din ba ang rate sa international criminal defense lawyers?
So there's a roster of lawyers who can appear at the ICC, mostly as defense counsel because also as counsel for victims, really, but not to prosecute because there is a prosecutor. I don't know how many there are now in the roster, 600 lawyers perhaps. Some of them are from the global north. People like Kaufman, he's British, but he's also Israeli. I don't know how much they get paid, but certainly the ICC has funding for legal aid, and that's how some indigent defendants have funded their lawyer. Sometimes when a person is not indigent, he has assets. Bemba, for example, their family owned the biggest airline in the DRC. He had houses in Portugal. But he also lost access to his assets because the ICC prosecutor requested a freeze on those assets. He could not pay his lawyers, I think including Kaufman, if I'm not mistaken. So So it happens that some defense counsel will have problems getting paid because their clients are either too poor or their assets are frozen. I don't know whether that will happen to Rodrigo Duterte, but certainly Rodrigo Duterte has friends in high places. Maybe they will help out.
Is it possible to get 100% legal aid from the OPCD of the ICC? Pwede bang makalibre siya ng legal ng defense?
Only if you consider him indigent. I mean, you see videos of him, eating pedestrian food in the Philippines. I don't know if that proves anything. It proves that he eats pedestrian food. It doesn't prove that he has no money. Certainly, because the Office of the Ombudsman in the Philippines, I think, has restricted the submission of statement of assets and liabilities. There's no way for Filipinos to know what his assets are. But Rappler has copies of corporations in which
2017, have copy of the 2017 SAL and my 20 million pesos ata siya at the time. We don't know how much
right, but those are only the documents that you can access publicly. But I'm not sure that he will be categorized as indigent, and so he will have to figure out how to pay his lawyers.
All right, thank you so much. Ang haba nun, but I hope and I'm sure that audiences can take away something from it, because we are all in this journey of learning about an alien court that is the ICC. Thank you so much. This has been Rappler Talk. Thank you for watching.